Sophia Kreski.
Hello. Hello from New York. I'm Nina Khrushcheva. I'm professor of international affairs at the New School and also a fellow at the Kreisky Forum, where I'm responsible for the project titled Russia on the World Stage. Today, however, we are not going to talk about Russia. We are going to talk about transatlantic relations with Ian Buruma, who is our guest today. He hardly needs any introduction. He's an amazing author and a professor at Bard College. And his book that we're discussing is called The Churchill Complex, The Curse of Being Special, from Winston and FDR to Trump and Brexit. So this is the book. It came out in 2020, and I strongly, strongly recommend it. It is really very beautiful. It has zero extra words, and every word there is absolutely in place and appropriate, which is quite rare. So very elegant and very crisp book. I'm a great fan, and it's an honor to have Ian talk to us today. So thank you.
Thank you.
So I'd like to, in fact, I actually wanted to mention another book on sort of similar subject. It's an older one. It's 20 years old, called Anglomania. And I remember I fell in love with it when I first read it. And so now the Churchill Complex is sort of the conclusion to, well, not conclusion, but a sort of step into that direction, trying to understand Anglomania, relationship with Europe, and relationship with the United States. So my first question is probably very obvious, and please forgive me, you don't need to answer long, but what is a Churchill complex? Who suffers from it?
Well, what I mean by the Churchill complex is the idea after World War II by the two victorious Anglophone powers, because of course the Soviet Union did most of the fighting in Europe, but the two English-speaking powers, the United States and Britain, came out of the war as victors, and which was a very good thing. Thank goodness they did. But victors can start believing in their own myths. And by the Churchill complex, I really mean the tendency, especially among American presidents, perhaps more than British prime ministers, of wanting to be the Churchill of their time, and which led to foolish wars fought because they didn't want to be Chamberlain in 1938, which is the ghost that keeps on coming up every time there is a foreign crisis.
So the weak.
Appeasing a hostile or dictatorship. And too many American presidents, they put the Churchill's bust in the Oval Office, and too many of them want to be Churchill. And Churchill was a great wartime prime minister. His finest hour was in 1940, when nobody believed Britain could stand up to Nazi Germany. And he, by the sheer force of his rhetoric, kept his country going at a time of enormous crisis. But he's not the sort of man who, in normal circumstances, is needed or should be imitated. And the Churchill complex is really that idea that he's the one to be imitated, and certainly not Chamberlain.
And why you say the American presidents rather than British prime ministers?
Well, because
what is his main attraction to the Americans?
Well, Churchill, in order to get the Americans into the war, which was by no means a given in 1940, when the Americans were still, or public opinion in America was still quite isolationist. They didn't want to get involved in another European war. The British were not particularly popular here. And Churchill was desperate for America to come into the war because he knew that Britain alone couldn't win it. And so he played up not only his own family background, having an American mother, but this idea of the special relationship, the English-speaking peoples, etc. And our kith and kin in the United States and all that, as though this was sort of a natural alliance. And Americans, I think, were rather flattered by that. And after the war, Britain lost the power to have a significant impact on the world anymore, but the Americans did. And so American presidents had real power to start wars and to shape the world in the way they wanted, at least until the end of the 20th century. And so it made sense for an American president to model himself on Churchill. It made less sense for a British prime minister because Britain didn't have the clout anymore.
But Boris Johnson now is evoking Churchill all the time as a...
Yes, but Boris Johnson is not a serious figure. I mean, he's a showman who deals in fantasies. And he did that as a journalist, and he does that as a politician. And this fantasy of British greatness and himself as a sort of a great man in the mold of Churchill and so on, that's what it is. It's a fantasy. It has no basis in reality.
So he just takes a myth as a caricature and turns into a caricature.
Yes.
In a sense. But what is a special relationship then? It's the English-speaking world only, or?
Well, what it meant something different to Churchill in 1941 when the Americans finally came in than it did to Roosevelt, President Roosevelt. President Roosevelt was, of course, of Dutch origin, something he was rather proud of. He did not have sentimental attachments to the English-speaking races, as Churchill would have put it. But he did see Britain and America as natural allies to, as he would have seen it at the time, as fighting for democracy against fascism, Nazism, Japanese militarism, and so on. And so there was a sort of an alliance of democracies, and the British and the Americans saw themselves as the great upholders of democracy and even in some ways the inventors of it, which of course wasn't quite true. Democracy has a much longer history, but the Anglosphere at the time very much identified itself with liberal democracy. And so it had a meaning during the war. It had some meaning after the war. For some decades after the war, Britain still had enormous prestige, could have shaped Europe if they'd wanted to. I mean, the other Europeans, demoralized, unsure of themselves after the war because of Nazi occupation and because of Hitler and so on, would very much have welcomed Britain to lead the new Europe, but the British had no interest
rather than the Americans. They would rather have...
Well, no, the Americans wanted this too. No, rather than the French or the Germans, because the Germans certainly didn't want to lead anything after their experience. The French would have liked to, and de Gaulle certainly had that pretension. But in the late 1940s, it was handed on a plate to the British to be the leaders, and the British had no interest in it. They thought they were superior to the rest of Europe. They had no interest in European institutions. They thought their own were good enough, indeed better, and so they made a huge historical mistake, in my view, but also in the view of the Americans, that the Americans wanted the British to lead Europe as a sort of bridge between Europe and America, and it's a role that Britain has sort of played on and off, but never as powerfully as they could have if they'd taken their chances in the 40s.
So when you talk about this special relationship, so it appears that together they needed, because England, Great Britain was a waning imperial power, but it would give legitimacy of imperial power to the United States, which was taking over and would be on the coattails of Britain, in a sense, in the kind of giving them the baton of...
Well, that's the way it's often seen, as though the Americans simply took over from the British Empire. Not quite so simple. First of all, the Americans, in the way they see themselves, of course, is not as an imperial power. They see themselves as an anti-imperialist power, and we're not sympathetic to European colonial enterprises, and we're often on the side of the colonized, not for long, because during the Cold War, when the British found it fairly easy to manipulate the Americans into thinking that any kind of nationalist movement in the former empires was communist, and then the Americans would take the other side. But they like to see themselves as a country that has the mission to spread freedom and democracy in the world. And again, this is something that the British had too. I mean, it's another aspect of the special relationship, that it was not just that they saw themselves as the upholders of democracy, but they saw it as a kind of Anglo-Saxon mission to spread democracy, largely a fantasy too, but it was a powerful fantasy. And the Americans certainly had that. So they weren't keen on the British Empire. They did take over a lot of the power that the British Empire had in the form of bases, military bases in the Middle East and in Asia and so on. On the other hand, American presidents were not entirely sure of themselves as a quasi-imperial power or world power. After all, they'd been, relatively isolationist before the war, and they wanted the British really to help them police the world. And they were very upset when the British left a lot of their colonial possessions too quickly. And during the Vietnam War, they wanted the British to be involved, even if only symbolically, because they didn't want to fight it alone.
But when you write about, so you have this pairings of British and American. I mean, a lot of it is Churchill, but then there are others, and kind of the tradition continues. But you write even Roosevelt and Churchill had rather tense relationships because...
Well, they did, partly because of that, the idea of empire. For example, one of the great moments of the Roosevelt-Churchill relationship was in 1941, before the Americans were attacked in Pearl Harbor by the Japanese, so before they were in the war. And they met secretly in Newfoundland on two battleships, British and American. And they made they came up with the so-called Atlantic Charter, which was the sort of blueprint for what the world should look like after the defeat of Nazi Germany and Japan. And Roosevelt, as an anti-imperialist, was very keen on the idea of national independence, that every people should have the right to rule their own country and should be independent. Churchill saw great dangers in this because he absolutely had no desire to let the Indians, say, be independent. He wanted the empire to go on, and Roosevelt did not, and bullied Churchill rather on giving the Indians independence even during the war. So there were a lot of tensions. They came to some kind of compromise on this. Well, that was, I suppose, the main thing. I mean, and Roosevelt was not an Anglophile. I mean, he really didn't have much sympathy for Churchill's pretensions in that sense.
But also when you talk, so there's Roosevelt and Churchill, and there are all these other pairings that you are describing. And what's really interesting, how each pairing you deal with in terms of a crisis.
Yes.
So there's always some crisis with suddenly almost always British and American are on one side, and then sort of have to rope in or convince or not convince other Europeans.
Well, except there were some great exceptions to this, and the main one was the Suez Crisis, right, when the British and the French and the Israelis wanted to basically get rid of Nasser, who they saw. This was another one of these many 1938 moments when the ghost of Chamberlain and appeasement in Munich was brought up, in this case because they saw Nasser as a kind of fascist, and if they didn't stop him, the same sort of thing would happen that happened in World War II. That was the idea, and the Americans under Roosevelt was very, very much opposed to this. The Vietnam War was another case where Harold Wilson, who was then Prime Minister of Britain, a Labour Prime Minister, head of a party that was very much against the Vietnam War. And you had Lyndon Johnson, who was not an Anglophile either. I didn't believe in all that nostalgia particularly. but wanted the British to be part of the war to give the Americans legitimacy. And it made it very difficult for Wilson because, on the one hand, he was rather nostalgic for the special relationship and believed that Britain and America had more in common than Britain had with the continent of Europe, wanted to please the Americans, which most prime ministers in Britain want, because ever since the war, they thought, as Churchill did, that the only way for Britain to be a major power, to punch above its weight, as they said, was to be very close to America. Not all prime ministers. Edward Heath did not think that. He was very much a European. Harold Macmillan didn't think that in the end. I mean, he thought that the only way Britain could play a significant role was in Europe. Nonetheless, most British prime ministers have felt this. And so, yes, they were often...
most American presidents, even some of them
except
less.
Most American presidents thought that the British were being a bit ridiculous in their nostalgia.
Kind of.
They wanted Britain to be a European power and play a role in Europe that would be to the benefit of the United States. Most American presidents did not admire this notion held in London that the British should be sort of an adjunct to Washington instead of playing a much more
being in Europe.
Intensive role in Europe. Yeah.
But when you say that Harold Macmillan wasn't too much of a his mother, right? His mother was
American,
and he had very good relations, very close relationship with Kennedy.
He did. No, he. That's the other aspect, of course, of these different pairings of prime ministers and presidents. On the one hand, you're right that each chapter has a crisis, but of course there is always a crisis. But the personalities of these figures, of course, also plays an important role, and some of them got on very well, and some of them didn't. But Macmillan, yes, he admired Kennedy. He liked his youth, his energy, the glamour. Whereas Kennedy admired the old school English gentleman, the statesman, the wise older man, and so on in Macmillan. But Macmillan saw very clearly that in order to still play a significant role in the world, Britain had to be a European power, to be inside Europe, and not somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic. And de Gaulle didn't let him, of course, because de Gaulle wanted the French to be the dominant power and saw Britain's entry into Europe, or the European Economic Community as it was then, as a kind of Trojan horse that would make Europe subservient to the United States.
And he was also trying, when the United States was trying to, or the Soviet Union under Khrushchev were trying to have a relationship with the United States, de Gaulle in 1960 invited Khrushchev to Paris, so he would be that general who brings the Soviet Union into the Western fold.
De Gaulle was had his own fantasies, of course, of French grandeur and all that. But he played the Russian card really to tell the Americans that he could be independent. But when it came in times of crisis, he also made it very clear that France would be with NATO. But just like the Germans have often played the Russian card to show that they're not simply an American lackey. And that there are other interests, and that they're Europeans, and that they can look east as well as west, and so on. But certainly the British have not done that. They also prime ministers often wanted to go to Moscow to show that they were serious players. They all did that, I mean, including Macmillan and
Macmillan actually had a very famous trip. Nobody even told him to go. And in 1960, I forgot. 59, I think he went on his own trying to resolve the Berlin crisis.
Yes, well, then the British, of course, still were a significant power. But and in the Berlin crisis, the British still played a major role. But even after Britain had lost much of its empire and was no longer, was very much the weaker partner in the relationship, British prime ministers still had that idea that if they could, they were perhaps wiser, more experienced than these energetic but callow Americans. And that if only, and Churchill himself had this strong belief, if only he could go to Moscow and talk to Stalin or Brezhnev.
He talked to Khrushchev,
and Khrushchev. Yeah, but during the war, I think he
that was Stalin, but
then it was Khrushchev. That's right. But if
they actually got along,
they may very well have, but of course, in the end, the Russians had to look to the United States, not to Britain.
Of course.
But the prime ministers had that idea that they could play this role and keep the world in peace by being the sort of the diplomatic power. That was not quite the same game that de Gaulle was playing, I don't think, or the Germans with their Ostpolitik. But the British certainly always looked west, which is one of the things that irritated the French. And de Gaulle, there was a famous conversation just on the eve of D-Day, the landings in Normandy, 1944, where de Gaulle and Churchill have a row. And Churchill says to de Gaulle, if we ever have to choose between the wide ocean and America by implication and Europe, we will choose the ocean. And de Gaulle never forgot this. And so never really saw Britain as a real European power.
But also Britain itself didn't see itself as a real European power, right? Because that whole Commonwealth that Churchill was designing, essentially that is a European Union. It came out as a European Union formula, yes, but also came out of this endless tensions, because it seems, at least what I gathered from your book, is that the tensions were such through all of this, even friendly relationship, is that they would choose not countries that very close across the English Channel, but they would be feeling much closer to a country that is way across the ocean.
I think probably that was true of public opinion. It was true of many politicians, but there were always countervailing forces too. I mean, don't forget that in 2016, almost half the country voted to stay in Europe.
Right.
And so parties were divided on this issue, on the left and on the right. There were always pro-Europeans and anti-Europeans, but on the whole, yes, public opinion and many of the politicians that represented public opinion thought that Britain was closer to the United States in terms of language, but also in terms of culture and so on, than they were to Europe. But again, there are exceptions. Edward Heath did not think that. Tony Blair in the beginning did not think that, and he ended up thinking that. John Major did not really think that. But most prime ministers, by and large, did take that view.
So most prime ministers really buy into that special relationship.
Yes.
Almost a myth, but then it becomes their course of action in a sense. Even for some of them, it is not.
Even when the Americans were not encouraging it, and in fact were discouraging it, it was the British are the ones who really tried desperately to hang on to that myth of the special relationship. Not so much the Americans.
The Americans were just taking it as a.
Well, sometimes even found it annoying. I mean, already in the days of Lyndon Johnson in the 60s, they were taking Bonn, the German capital, more seriously than London, because they saw that Germany was a more serious, economically, a greater power, more important, increasingly more important than Britain. I mean, they liked going to Britain and going to Windsor Castle and meeting the Queen and all that. But apart from all that flim-flam, they knew that Germany was a more important country. And so this notion of the special relationship meant much, much less in Washington than it did in London.
Well, your chapter when you're describing Barack Obama, I mean, that certainly seems to be
he
that
didn't
tradition.
care.
He didn't care at all.
He didn't care at all. No. George W. Bush and his father cared a little, but not that much. I mean, George W. Bush was from Texas.
Well, he cared when Tony Blair went completely after him, right? With the
well, he cared,
of
but
the
that was
willing
the same as Johnson in the Vietnam War,
right.
and that Britain, in the invasion of Iraq, Britain couldn't really play a very significant military role, as the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, said at the time. You know, it's nice if they join us, but we don't really need them. But they needed them for political reasons. They wanted their backup. And Tony Blair completely fell for that, because he had that. Not only was he a real believer in the Churchill myth. I mean, he really had the Churchill complex. He was a believer in that Britain and America had the mission to liberate the world from dictators. So he believed that. I mean, he had a religious belief almost in it, as did George W. Bush. So they understood one another on that level. But he also believed that Britain should hang on to America come what may, whereas the Americans cared much less about that. I mean, it was useful, but it was not for them an existential thing.
But if Tony Blair didn't go so much into that coalition of the willing agenda, the Iraq War may have been different, right? If America didn't have that much backing from England.
Well,
right?
It would have gone ahead anyway. But if Britain had made common cause with France and Germany at the time, it would have strengthened their position in Europe. It would have been better for the EU. It would have been better for Tony Blair, because it destroyed his otherwise quite successful prime ministership. But I don't think it would have stopped the Americans.
No, I don't think so either. But I think it would have given America less of that kind of superiority complex that they can go in and do those things. Because if the whole Europe would be united against it, then probably it would be a different outcome. Well, I don't think that Rumsfeld or Cheney would care one way or another.
No, I don't, because don't forget also Europe was divided. That what Rumsfeld called the old Europe and the new Europe. The old
Poland,
Europe.
Remember that, and Poland. So there's
well, that's the new Europe.
Right. No, so, I know, but they were the ones supporting the United States.
And I think the Czech Republic, and including many of the old anti-communist dissidents like Adam Michnik and Václav Havel and so on, they were all in favor of the war. So it was the old Western democracies that were against it, except Tony Blair, but many in his party were against it, and many people in Britain were against it. So it would certainly have been better for Britain if he hadn't done it. But I don't think, as you say, I don't think it would have made very much difference to the Americans. I don't think the people in the Bush administration really cared very deeply. I mean, it was useful. But
no, and I mean, I'm sure Rumsfeld and Cheney certainly wouldn't care, but it was incredibly useful, and probably it would have been different if Britain didn't use its special relationship to support the United States. That's the only thing I'm saying. What other instances? I think there's a very interesting story you're telling about Israel and Palestine when Britain kind of started going away in the late 40s, and the United States got involved, and suddenly just got a giant crisis with settlements and whatnot.
Well, it wasn't so much the settlements. It was more that Britain had got itself into an impossible position because of the Balfour Declaration, where they basically promised the Jews one thing and the Arabs another, and they were in conflict. I mean, they promised the Jews that they could have their state in Palestine, and they promised the Arabs that they wouldn't lose any rights and would still be their country and so on. Well, these were incompatible. Right? And but this was before, of course, World War II. After World War II, it became a real crisis because you had the survivors of the Holocaust who had nowhere to go. If they were from Lithuania or Poland or Belarus or something, they couldn't go home. There was nothing there for them. They'd lost their families, their friends, they weren't welcome. The Americans, by and large, wouldn't let them in. Most European countries were not keen to have Jewish survivors or refugees. So often Palestine was the one place they could go. But the British had promised the Arabs that they
Will stay there too.
That of course would stay there. They knew that if they had large numbers of Jews suddenly going to Palestine, there would be tremendous trouble. It was a British mandate. They felt that the trouble would run out of control. And so they tried to minimize the number of Jews who could go to Palestine. And then the Americans sort of played a double-faced game, because they went against the British and insisted that the British should allow large-scale emigration of European Jews to Palestine, but largely because they didn't allow them to come to the United States.
Right. So that's how it became 100,000 rather than 1,500.
Yes, and that became a source of tremendous tension. And in the end, of course, people did go to Israel and or Palestine, as it still was. And the British couldn't control it. And they really wanted the Americans then to take over. And in the end, the British threw up their hands and gave up.
And basically kind of even gave up more power and potential superiority to the Americans in a sense from then on.
As a result, yes.
And basically never challenged the United States, because Churchill would still challenge the US kind of meddling and everything and being...
Yes, but in the Middle East, they just didn't have the clout anymore to control it. I mean, they couldn't control what was going on in Palestine, and the Americans wouldn't. And so in the end, the Jewish state, Israel, in 1948, was an inevitable conclusion from this. And it was very much, of course, also backed by Russia, by the Soviet Union. That was the outcome, but after a lot of bloodshed.
But those tensions, like in Suez or in Israel and Palestine, still, in many ways, didn't break the special relationship, right? And they continued to deal with crisis as if the two countries would deal with crisis better than the rest. I mean, we're seeing it today, even with the Russian-Ukraine crisis. So Europe is sort of on that one side saying we need to talk to Putin, and the Anglo-Saxon world, so to speak, says, no, the war's coming tomorrow.
Yes, that is true. But I think unlike in the 40s and 50s and even 60s, the British role in this is kind of a joke. I mean, nobody takes it seriously. Whereas what is going on in Paris and Berlin is taken seriously, but even by Putin. Whereas he doesn't.
No, it actually is taken seriously by Putin.
Yes, but he wouldn't take the Boris Johnson or
Liz Truss. I mean,
seriously.
But you can't, because she doesn't even know geography.
This has become a kind of cartoon version of the special relationship. I mean, even Biden doesn't take London seriously in this case, I don't think. So. Yes, it's sort of reenacting.
So they're doing it, just reenacting that Churchill complex.
Absolutely, and it's all they've got, because they're no longer in the EU, so they can't play a role as a EU power, and so all they can do is strut around in posture and be laughed at by everybody. That's.
But what does, I mean, I understand that Johnson is a performer, but how? Because it does reflect badly on Britain. How does he plan to handle it, or it doesn't matter to him? It's like for Trump, it really doesn't matter.
I don't think he cares about what it does to the fortunes of Britain.
Right.
He cares about his own image inside Britain and how it might affect his own political fortunes. And he might still hope that by criticizing the Europeans and by pretending to be a sort of player in this, that it makes him look good. I don't think it's working. I don't think most people in Britain are particularly impressed by this either. But yeah, it's all they've got left. I mean, when in the EU, Britain in these crises could still play an important role because they were a European power. Now they're on their own, and this is pure posturing and nostalgia. Whereas in many instances in the past, it was a little bit more than that.
But Brexit, sort of the whole process of Brexit, is it part of the ridiculous posturing, or it is a result in some way of a Churchill complex? The kind of nostalgia for that past when Britain had green pastures and ladies.
Well,
I think you quoted George Orwell, and when ladies are cycling.
Yeah, that was in the John Major Prime Minister, his campaign. I think the nostalgia played a big role in the campaign for Brexit. So there were images of Spitfires and Churchill in our finest hour, and when we stood alone and against Nazi Germany and so on. Brexit is not the result of that nostalgia. It's the result of the fact that the British never really found their proper place in Europe. They were, and on the right, in the Tory party in particular, but not only in the Tory party, there was an anti-EU left as well. There was still this sense of unease about Britain's role in Europe. And this was exploited more and more. First started under Margaret Thatcher, although Margaret Thatcher would not have dreamt of leaving the EU, but she stirred that kind of nationalism up in her speeches and so on, and making it seem as though Europe was a kind of colonial power that Britain had to oppose in many ways.
But she did think that, I mean, in some ways.
Well, but she was the architect of the single market too. So she in pragmatic terms, she thought like a European.
Or she thought like Churchill, right? Because he wanted a Commonwealth in which Britain would be the...
Yes, but Churchill's idea in 1946, I think, when he gave a speech in Zurich, was that there would be a United States of Europe, but Britain would not necessarily be part of it. They would sponsor it and be sympathetic, but would not necessarily be part of it. Margaret Thatcher never doubted that Britain was part of Europe. But she did give these stir-up nationalism rhetorically, and so the right wing of the Tory party kept on pushing for that, not for leaving the EU, but for a referendum and fighting the EU and talking about sovereignty and behaving like a kind of not just a rebel, but sort of
like with a certain power,
like a special power that was hostile to the very institutions that they were part of, and that got exploited in the end by the far right in Britain, by Nigel Farage, who then drove the right of the Tories to become more and more vociferously anti-EU. Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, then foolishly called for a referendum, thinking he would win anyway.
Well, you explain it sort of in this character, very prestigious, Eton graduated, Oxford graduate. He just couldn't even think that those ideas would not be supported because he offers them.
And it was at the same time you had the Obama administration who couldn't imagine that people would not vote for Hillary Clinton.
Right.
I mean, they were blinded by this illusion that this was they were basically the ruling class. They knew best.
That everybody wants rationality and knowledge rather than drinking a beer with somebody.
That's right. And so the right-wing Tories, the Brexiteers, played on public emotions, on discontent with the elites, the same things that were behind the election of Trump. Widespread discontent, give the elite a bloody nose, and so on. Many people probably voted for Brexit thinking that Brexit would never win, but it was a protest vote. And yes, an element of nostalgia as well. Well, we know where it ended up.
We do, but we also don't. I mean, how does, for example, Cameron deals with his existence? I mean, how does he wake up in the morning?
Well, it's very difficult to say what goes on in the minds of
because he was writing a book, right? He was writing a book, and then it didn't get published, or was delayed in publication.
It was published. It's a very boring book. People rationalize these things. They have to. And politicians have thick skins, and they think politically. They're usually not particularly reflective people who anguish over what they do, and when they do, it's often not an advantage. I think Obama is a good example, a rare American president who was sort of an intellectual, and not only a very good writer himself, but also a reader. And he did anguish over his decisions, and that wasn't always a success. I think some good politicians are often not very reflective people who react to circumstances, and sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't. And when it doesn't, they'll find reasons for why they were still right and that kind of thing.
And you describe it with Obama is that there were certain crises at the time, the Arab Spring, the taking out of Gaddafi, when he sort of waffled and he didn't go with and you give an example of El-Sisi in Egypt, how since Obama was having tensions about this, it could have gone differently if he were more decisive.
Well, I think the Obama administration had a problem in foreign policy in that his advisors, or the foreign policy people in his administration, were very divided. They were divided between interventionists who believed that it was the American mission, and this is an old Democrat idea, much stronger than amongst the Republicans. The Republicans tended to be a business-minded party that wanted to do what was good for American business, and intervening in the name of freedom and democracy was not usually what they were interested in. That was a democratic thing, and which is why they got into the Vietnam War. But you had people around Obama who believed in American, what they then called humanitarian intervention.
Right, it's Samantha Power.
Samantha Power and others, and Susan Rice, and Tony Blair, of course, in Britain, was very much a believer in that. But Joe Biden, as vice president, did not believe in that. Obama was torn. And being a reflective man, a bit like Jimmy Carter when he was president, saw one side of the argument and then he saw the other side of the argument, couldn't make up his mind, and so whereas a real successful political leader, he makes decisions. And
like Trump.
Yeah, they don't anguish over these things. I mean, they're quick, and it doesn't, what they decide is not always carried out quickly, but
or not always right.
Certainly not always.
Very often is not.
Absolutely.
But for Obama, that was a problem precisely because he was too smart to be a politician.
Yeah, he was too much of a Hamlet. I mean, he just couldn't make up his mind. And yeah, making up your mind too quickly is obviously not a good thing either. But not being able to make up your mind is a weakness if you're a leader.
How does it now? So the Churchill complex played out almost. I mean, I think that's why it's such a kind of beautiful book also, because it started with Churchill and ended with Trump. Started with this Commonwealth idea and European home, and then ended with Brexit. Mm-hmm. So where do we go from there? I mean, so we talk about the transatlantic relationship. What's Europe and Britain? How do they fix that broken bond that really was built tortuously over centuries, and now it seems to be...
no, it wasn't built over centuries, because don't forget America and Britain went to war. I mean, they weren't always natural allies, and America, the American Republic came out of a rebellion against the British king.
No, so, I meant with Europe. I mean,
with
Europe sort of.
I see what you mean. I see what you mean.
So what's now there?
Well, first of all, and that'll be a gradual process, but I would imagine, and we're already seeing it, American domination is greatly diminished. I mean, it's no longer the power it was in the 20th century. And China is now, of course, much more powerful. Not more powerful than America yet, but it is a great power. The post-war order, as it was fixed in the 40s, the sort of Pax Americana in East Asia and in Western Europe, where the United States took care of the security of its democratic allies, and the allies could then concentrate on economic affairs and rebuilding their wealth and so on. That is also unraveling, I think. It's not unraveling fast because the Japanese, for example, for reasons of their own constitutional and so on, memories of the war, are very reluctant to play a major military role independently from the Americans. So they're still very dependent on the United States. In Europe, especially the French, are more and more keen that Europe starts to wean itself from its dependence on the United States. And the Trump administration obviously concentrated minds and speeded that process up, that you couldn't depend on America.
But you describe also it began with Barack Obama, right? When he started asking for 2% already and saying,
yes,
well, these
I mean, the
countries...
Americans are also tired of being the defenders and paying
for rich
a great deal of money
for
countries that are often richer than the United States in some respects. So I think that post-war order is now very shaky. Now, what will replace it, of course, is the big question, and we don't know the answer. Because of Brexit, I don't think Britain will play a very large role in this. I mean, it's going to be shaped.
Despite all these dreams of becoming the great Britain.
I think they'll become a much more provincial country. And I think that the decisions are going to be made in Brussels and in Berlin and in Paris, as far as Europe is concerned. And I hope that it will lead to a stronger Europe and a more independent Europe that could still be an ally of the United States.
Or Great Britain, for that matter.
Or Great Britain, for that matter. In fact, it would have to be, because Britain is the only European country, Britain and France are the only European countries that have some kind of military force.
And nuclear power.
And nuclear power. And so they would have to be involved in that sense. But they have a much weaker hand to play than they did when they were in the EU, I think. And so I see the sort of Franco-German axis gaining in power, and Britain being the loser.
And now, so Boris Johnson survived for now, although of course there were predictions that he will lose the vote of confidence. So does he have a chance for re-election, or Britain is tired of him and wants somebody more rational and normal?
I think his days are probably numbered. And what could happen, and what I hope will happen, is that a more sensible government comes to power in Britain under Labour or even under the Tories, and that eventually they will not probably rejoin the EU.
Because it's just by now too expensive, right?
Be difficult. But what might happen is that they will rejoin the single market, which would already be a great improvement, because a lot of the problems we're seeing now is not because they left the EU, but because they left the single market. The problems in Northern Ireland and with fishery and with the bureaucracy and all that kind of stuff. So they may end up having a much closer relationship with the EU again. Oh, I can only hope so. But at the moment, they're floundering, I think.
And Johnson needs to keep the animosity going because that's his ticket, right?
Any Tory government that is dominated by the Brexit faction will blame Europe for everything, yeah. So, but again, that may not be forever. It may be that at some point you get a more sensible Tory government and who will look for ways to get closer to Europe again.
Well, on this note, I do hope that all of us in every country, including my native Russia, will look for more sensible government and more sensible solutions and try to work with other people rather than working against them. Ian, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you. And we'll see you soon, we hope, in Vienna.
I certainly hope so.